Hey guys, weary traveller, and welcome to this cozy corner of history. Tonight, we return to the Middle Ages, in what I call the villainous winter. Before our journey back in time begins, I truly want to know, where are you watching from in the world, and what time is it for you right now? Isn't it amazing that across so many time zones, countries and cultures, we're able to meet here, to explore history's mysteries together? So, if you share the same passion for these stories, feel free to leave a comment, share where you are and how you feel. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly feel this journey is worth it. Now it's time to lean back, dim the lights, and enjoy the ride. Medieval winter was not gentle, not romantic, and not even remotely warm. It was like an invisible enemy, knocking at the door each year, carrying with it a skin-cutting cold and a single challenge. Will you survive me? Facing that trial, you, the ordinary folk who made up the majority of Europe's population, had no fortified castles, no luxurious fur cloaks, no mulled wine or lavish feasts. Only fragile huts, rough cloth, meagre food, and a staggering resilience. Your house was built from wood, mud, straw, and even animal dung. Crude, yes, but that was all you had. Thick earthen walls still couldn't keep the wind from howling in. Thatched roofs, after a few snowstorms, would start to leak, cave in, or worse, let squirrels, mice, and birds sneak in to share your shelter. The floor was packed dirt. In the rainy season, water seeped up, turning your home into a freezing swamp. In winter, the ground hardened like stone, ice shooting up through your bones. And yet, in this harshness, people still built a home. Fragile, but the only refuge against winter's fury. There was no spring mattress, no thick quilts. Your bed was a sack of straw, or sometimes just a pile of hay on the floor. Sleeping there meant rustling noises, sharp straw pricking your back, and uninvited guests like fleas and lice. But straw, inconvenient as it was, became a thin shield, holding in just enough warmth. In those long nights, comfort didn't matter. What mattered was waking up alive the next morning. You wore every piece of clothing you owned. A worn linen shirt, a few rough wool layers, and on top, a smelly sheepskin. Feet wrapped in rags, stuffed into wooden clogs. You were a walking onion, layered, clumsy, heavy, but still standing against the bitter wind. Laundry was rare in winter, not out of laziness, but necessity. Clothes hung outside would freeze stiff. Layers of dirt, sweat, and grease clung on, becoming an accidental form of insulation. Dirty, yes, but survival always trumped appearances. Behind that ragged look was a stubborn spirit. As long as I live, I don't care how I look. Inside the hut, the hearth was not just for cooking, it was life itself, the only thing keeping deathly frost outside the door. No grand fireplaces, only a small pit fire, its smoke seeping into every crevice. People lived choking, coughing, eyes stinging, just to trade it for fragile warmth. To keep the fire alive overnight, you banked it, burying hot embers under ash, so they could be revived at dawn. A single surviving coal was hope itself, proof you'd beaten the night. Fire was the banner of defiance against winter, small, flickering, but unyielding. Survival strategies included sleeping together, whole families huddled in a corner, sometimes even bringing livestock inside. Children in the middle, grandparents at the edges, everyone pressed tight, human breath as a living blanket. Eating before bed, a bowl of thick porridge, a boiled turnip, or, on lucky days, some salted meat. A full belly didn't just fight hunger, it generated warmth. Hot stones and straw, stones heated in the flame, fire, wrapped in cloth, tucked into hay, a medieval hot water bottle. Breathing wisely, you learned to breathe slowly, through the nose, to soften the damage of cold air. Children were taught young, breathe wrong, and sickness will take you. Survival was never an individual task. Neighbors watched over each other. If one house had no smoke, another would bring over embers. Villages shared handfuls of grain or jars of pickles to keep hunger away, and in the long nights, you prayed together. Faith, whispered prayers by the hearth, candlelight flickering on rough wooden tables, all became threads binding people to hope. Yet no matter the resilience, some winters were merciless. Whole families found frozen in each other's arms. Some years, famine erased entire villages. The cruel truth: not everyone conquered the winter, but even in death, they clung to one another, passing along the last trace of warmth, a final symbol of human solidarity. Looking back, peasants left behind no grand castles or epic songs, but they left a silent legacy: endurance. From patched huts, straw beds crawling with vermin, smoke-filled hearths, all of it tells a story of survival. Today, we sit in warm rooms, with thick blankets, heaters, and bright lights. But remember, every comfort we enjoy is the result of centuries of humanity's fight against the cold. And those medieval peasants, with all their hardships, proved that survival doesn't come from wealth, but from unbreakable spirit. Medieval winter wasn't just about the cold. It was a chain of trials, closing in on people from every direction: hunger, disease, darkness, and helplessness in the face of merciless nature. First came the cold that numbed the body. No double-glazed windows, no heaters. Frost crept through every crack in the walls, slipped through holes in the roof, and rose from the frozen ground. You could put on every piece of clothing you owned, bury yourself in straw, and still shiver as if the cold had claws digging into your bones. One night without fire wasn't just an uncomfortable morning, it was a death sentence. Next was hunger. In winter, the fields lay silent. No fresh grain, no vegetables. Everything depended on jars of grain, salted meat, or sacks of turnips stored away since autumn. But no matter how much you saved, it was never enough for those endless months. Families often split a single slice of stale bread, or cooked gruel so thin they called it the soup of tears. With empty stomachs gnawing, the cold crushed tired bodies even faster. Then came disease. Small, cramped houses packed with people and livestock. Smoke choking the air, these shelters became breeding grounds for illness. A stubborn cough could turn into pneumonia, and with the medicine of that age, it was almost always fatal. Children and the elderly were most vulnerable: a wrong breath, a high fever, and by morning a family might lose someone forever. And then there was darkness and isolation. Winter days were short, nights stretched on endlessly. Once the sun set, villages fell silent, only the wind howling against the walls. No lights, no entertainment, no escape. People lived in shadows, and shadows bred fear. A wolf's howl from the forest, a creaking door, or even the rustle of straw could make a family hold its breath. Finally, helplessness. Winter didn't ask permission. It came, stripped the fields bare, killed livestock, and severed hope. Peasants could only endure, with no other choice. Each day survived was a small victory. Each morning with smoke still rising from the hearth was a miracle. If there was one symbol of life in winter, it was fire. It's no accident that so many cultures treated fire as sacred. For medieval peasants, fire was survival itself. With fire, hope lived. Without it, you were finished. In every home, at the center, was a simple fire pit. No grand fireplace, no chimney. Smoke drifted straight up through the thatched roof, seeping into walls, filling the air. People lived in smoke, coughing, eyes stinging. But no one complained because the smoke was proof the fire still burned. Keeping the fire alive was everyone's duty. At night, they didn't let it die completely, but used a trick called banking the fire, burying embers under thick ash. So with a breath in the morning, the flames came back. Done right, the family was saved. Done wrong, they woke in freezing darkness, fumbling to spark fire with numb hands almost impossible. Sometimes, disasters struck. A goat, restless and itchy, jumped into the hearth, scattering embers. Or a gust of wind swept through a crack in the door, snuffing out the coals. Then, there was only one solution: run to a neighbor's house and beg for a glowing ember. Fire didn't just warm, it bound communities together. Everyone understood that sharing a coal was saving a life. Without luxurious fur coats, peasants fought the cold by wearing everything they had at once. A thin linen shirt, a rough wool tunic, topped with a heavy sheepskin cloak that reeked of animal, feet wrapped in rags and stuffed into wooden clogs. They looked like walking onions, layer after layer, clumsy, but each one a thin shield against the frost. Laundry was rare in winter, not out of laziness, but necessity. Streams froze solid, and clothes hung outside turned into walking ice blocks. So dirt, sweat, and grease built up on fabrics, accidentally creating an insulating layer. Disgusting maybe, but those dirty coats saved countless lives. In a world of deadly cold, cleanliness was a luxury. Hats, gloves, and scarves were treasures. A single wool cap could mean the difference between keeping your ears or losing them to frostbite. Children were wrapped so tightly they looked like moving potatoes. Every rag, no matter how tattered, whispered the same message. We haven't surrendered to winter. When fire grew weak and wind howled through the walls, people turned to the oldest heater of all, each other. Entire families, parents, grandparents, children, even distant relatives huddled in a corner, wrapped in torn blankets, lying on straw, becoming a human lasagna, layers of flesh, straw, and cloth. Sleeping in the middle was fortune warmth on all sides. Sleeping on the edge was misery, half your body hot, the other half frozen stiff. And if you rolled over in the night and shoved Auntie against the wall, congratulations, you were now the family villain. Babies and the elderly always slept in the middle, the safest spot. It wasn't just about warmth. It was a lesson in kinship. Protect the weakest with the breath of the community. Animals weren't left outside in winter. They lived inside with the people. Cows leaned against the walls. Goats pressed into corners. Chickens roosted in the straw. Pigs sprawled in the middle of the house. It was filthy. Of course, the stench unbearable. Dung across the floor, constant noise. But their body heat raised the room a few precious degrees. And in a fight against death, each degree was worth more than gold. Maybe it was in those winter nights, in darkness, with cows snorting and pigs grunting, that people learned a deeper truth. Survival doesn't care about species. One of the simplest yet most effective life hacks, eating well before sleep. Food back then was simple. Oat porridge, black bread, turnips, sometimes salted meat. But once it entered the stomach, it became the fuel that kept the body's fire burning through the night. People understood that an empty belly made the body an easy victim of the cold. Parents forced their children to eat, even if they hated turnips with all their hearts. No one cared about taste. The only question was, after eating, will you live until morning? Medieval people knew that breathing the wrong way could kill them. Breathing hard through the mouth dragged cold air straight into the lungs, the shortest path to pneumonia. That's why they trained themselves to breathe through the nose, slow and steady. Children were taught from a young age. Don't open your mouth in the cold. Parents wrapped scarves around their kids' faces, so the air had to pass through fabric before reaching the lungs. It looked a little funny, dirty faces, breath soaking the cloth, but it was a survival strategy for their lungs. One of the smartest inventions, hot stones and straw boxes. At night, people heated a stone in the fire, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it into the hay or under the bed. The stone held heat for hours, turning into a kind of medieval heating pad. There was also the hay box, a straw-lined container for keeping heat. During the day, they cooked porridge, then put the pot inside the hay box. The straw trapped the warmth, keeping the porridge hot until evening. And at night, that warm porridge became their anti-freeze medicine. Sometimes, whole villages laughed when someone wrapped a stone poorly and set the straw on fire. But better to risk a fire than let the cold swallow the family whole. Beyond physical methods, there were invisible weapons, faith and community. People prayed before bed, asking God to keep the fire alive, the roof standing, and their souls safe through the night. Flickering candles became lights of hope. Sometimes they sprinkled holy water around the hearth, believing it would drive away cold winds and evil spirits. More importantly, the community was the final armor. A household that lost its fire would have neighbors bring glowing embers to save them. When food ran short, the whole village pooled turnips and handfuls of grain. Everyone understood. Today I save someone. Tomorrow someone will save me. Every method of fighting the cold was crude, clumsy, sometimes even laughable. But behind it was one truth. They worked. Sleeping in smoke, wearing dirty clothes, lying beside pigs, eating thick porridge. None of it was out of choice, but out of survival. Winter pushed people against the wall, and in that corner they revealed extraordinary creativity, finding hundreds of ways to snatch another day of life. Each morning, when smoke still rose from a thatched roof, it wasn't just a sign of life, but a silent declaration. I haven't fallen yet. I will live one more day. Medieval winter was an invisible, relentless enemy. To fight it, peasants had nothing but homespun clothes, patched together from wool, linen, hides, and even dry straw. These garments didn't sparkle. They weren't fashionable in any modern sense, but they were survival armor. On the innermost layer, almost everyone wore linen underwear. Men called it a smock, women called it a chemise. Thin linen didn't provide much warmth, but it had one crucial advantage. It kept the body dry. In bone-cutting cold, the killer wasn't just the wind, but dampness. Once wool soaked up sweat and held it, the body chilled from the inside out, often fatally. Linen undergarments were long, reaching the knees, tied at the waist. Men wore additional linen shorts called brays, gathered at the knees. Women wore loose chemises, layering other garments over them. Children were simpler, just an old linen rag cut from a parent's shirt, wrapped around them like a sack. Crude as it was, linen was the foundation of all winter clothing. It acted like a filter, preventing sweat from becoming the cold's accomplice. Over linen came wool, the main weapon. Sheep were the living treasure of the countryside. From their fleece, women spun yarn, wove fabric, and sewed tunics. Each thick woolen tunic was like a portable fireplace. Wool insulated, thanks to its twisted fibers filled with tiny air pockets. Air trapped inside became natural insulation. Plus, wool contained lanolin, a natural oil with mild water resistance. So even under snow or drizzle, wool garments kept people relatively warm. Peasants often wore 2, even 3 layers of wool on days when the north wind blew hard. Just like that, they turned into walking onions. Each layer itched a little, but that itch was nothing compared to freezing to death. On the outside was the cloak, usually made of thick wool or sheepskin, with the fleece turned inward. A cloak that draped from shoulders to knees not only blocked the wind, but could also serve as a blanket at night. Along with the cloak came the hood. This was a small but vital invention. The hood hugged the head, covered the ears and the nape, and could be tied tight at the neck. Some had long tails called liripipe, which could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf. For peasants, the liripipe wasn't about fashion, it was about wrapping one more layer around the throat. The hood became the first shield against the wind. Without it, ears could freeze in just a few hours of icy gusts, sometimes even rot away. If the body was a castle, then the hands and feet were the weakest gates. Peasants knew well, losing feeling in fingers or toes was the signal of death. Hands. They used thick wool gloves, sometimes covered with leather. The common type was the mitten. Fewer fingers, better warmth. For heavy work, they wore an extra leather layer greased to resist water. Feet. This was the most dangerous part, because the earthen floor sucked away heat. People wrapped cloth around their feet, stuffed dry straw inside wooden clogs or leather shoes. Straw trapped warmth and absorbed moisture, but it had to be replaced often. On the coldest days, they tied extra pieces of hide around their ankles as short boots against the wind. Every step on the frozen ground was like walking on blades. And sometimes, changing the straw in time made the difference between life and death. People realized the cold invaded through the smallest gaps. That's why the neck, ears, nose, wrists and ankles were strategic points. Scarves. A strip of wool wrapped around the neck, sometimes soaked in. Sheep fat to block the wind. Hats. Wool caps or felt hats pressed tight, covering the whole head. The head lost the most heat, so keeping it warm was a survival law. Wrists and ankles. Always wrapped in cloth, tied tight so wind couldn't sneak in. Each little detail could add another hour of survival in a blizzard. Peasants didn't chase fashion, but their clothes weren't entirely grey either. From roots, leaves and bark, they dyed tones of brown, brick red, and olive green. A red scarf on a snowy day was like a moving flame, bringing spiritual comfort. There were days when just seeing someone walk by in a faded red cloak made the whole village feel warmer, not on their skin, but in their hearts. Peasants' clothes were always patched. Tear here, patch there. Worn hems got new fabric sewn on, holes in pants were stitched over. Every patch carried a story. That winter was so bitter I sat by the fire 3 days straight sewing this coat back together. Little by little, clothes turned into maps of memory. The stitches, the patches, the faded spots all created a special kind of beauty. The beauty of endurance. In a poor society, clothes weren't just for wearing, they were wealth. A good sheepskin cloak could be traded for sacks of grain, even used as collateral. Clothes passed from father to son, mother to grandchild. When too tattered, they were unravelled, cut down into rags, shoe liners, or pillow stuffing. Nothing was thrown away. If each garment was a wall, then medieval peasants were the most patient builders. They had no tailor shops, no industrial looms, no luxury brands, but with calloused hands, they built a clothing system that was both survival gear and cultural testimony. It all began with sheep. Sheep gave not only meat and milk, but also wool, the white gold of winter. Each spring, people sheared, dried, and handed the wool to village women. Spinning took place by the fire, the wheel humming, threads twisting together, mixing with the laughter of children. After spinning, they wove on rough wooden looms. The shuttle clacked rhythmically, like the heartbeat of the home. The woven cloth was rinsed in warm water and hung in the cold wind. That cold, once an enemy, now became an ally, tightening the fibres. Colours weren't just decoration, they were a spiritual language. Brown and grey, most common, from bark, ash and clay. Brick red, from madder roots, symbol of warmth. Light olive green, from leaves and flowers, carrying a breath of spring. Dyeing was a community event. Villagers gathered ingredients, boiled big pots, dipped the cloth. Children ran about, women chatted, men hauled wood. The result? Fabrics in gentle hues, softening the bleakness of snow. If men tended firewood, women were the soul of clothing. They spun wool, wove cloth, and knitted. They patched coats, added layers, pulled old stitches to reuse thread. They knew where clothes wore out first and reinforced those spots. They soaked cloth in sheep fat for waterproofing. A warm coat wasn't just a product, it was love and patience made visible. Every stitch whispered, "Wear this and survive another day." Peasants' clothing didn't change fast with trends, but it followed the rhythm of seasons. Spring-summer, light linen shirts, short-sleeved tunics, wooden sandals. Autumn, added wool layers, scarves, closed shoes. Winter, the entire arsenal was deployed: cloaks, hoods, gloves, straw-stuffed shoes, layered scarves. This wasn't just about comfort, but about preserving each garment's life. Wearing clothes out of season meant ruining them faster, and waste was something no one could afford. Dressing for winter was like gearing up for battle. Linen underlayer to wick sweat. Wool tunic, 1 or 2 layers. Rough wool pants, tied tight. Leather shoes, stuffed with straw. Thick cloak, hood on. Scarf wrapped and knotted. Gloves last of all. Every knot, every fold mattered. Forget one layer, tie one strap loose, and the wind would slip in, stealing away the hard-won warmth. Children lost heat easily, so they were wrapped in so many layers they looked like walking potatoes. They wore shortened hand-me-down shirts, sleeves too long rolled up and tied. Hats always covered their ears, scarves always wrapped their necks. Kids often complained of being hot while running around, but parents always reminded them, better a little hot now than a lifetime of cold. Those children, growing up in tight layers of fabric, learned from the start one lesson. Clothes weren't for beauty, they were for survival. The elderly were more fragile, so they were given the best layers. Thick cloaks, multiple scarves, hoods pulled tight at the nape. Many families had their parents sleep close to the hearth, where the smoke stung the eyes but the wind reached less. And sometimes, the oldest, most worn-out garment was kept not for thrift, but because it was the last shield for the weakest. Even within Europe, peasants' clothing differed. The north, thicker garments, more furs, straw-lined shoes were common. The south, fewer layers, lighter cloaks, but wool was still needed when cold winds blew. Mountain regions, goat hair, wild furs, short cloaks for climbing. Coastal regions, clothes rubbed with fat to resist the damp salt air. Each region developed its own survival fashion, but all shared one principle. Fighting cold was the absolute priority. Clothing as social symbols. Even among the poor, clothing marked status. Fine cloth and bright dyes signalled wealth. But for peasants, these differences mattered little. Warmth was everything. A well-patched coat that blocked the wind was worth more than a colourful but flimsy one. At church, people straightened their tunics, pulled down their hoods, tightened their scarves. No one dared stand before God in torn rags. Clothes became the minimum form of dignity. By day, clothing let people work, in fields, forests, with animals. But at night came the true trial. As the fire weakened and wind howled through cracks, the house turned into an ice cave. Then each layer of fabric became the final wall against death by frost. Nightshirts, usually dry linen with a thin wool tunic. Damp day linen was swapped out, so the body didn't sleep in sweat. Nightcaps, funny-looking but life-saving. They covered ears, held warmth at the head, where the body loses heat fastest. Thin scarves covered mouths, so cold air passed through fabric before reaching the lungs. Many children slept with mouths wrapped, so they wouldn't wake to violent coughing. Sometimes the whole family slept in their cloaks. Heavy, stiff, uncomfortable, but they trapped precious warmth. Through the long night, cloaks stopped being clothes. They became a second roof. Smoke clung to every fibre. The smell was sharp, but it meant we still have fire. Clothes were hung on wooden poles by the hearth. They dried faster, but also soaked up smoke, making them harder to ignite outside. Smoke darkened fabric, left an unshakable smell, but also gave accidental protection against insects. A smoked garment was warmer and less flea-ridden, an unexpected double benefit. And so, clothing and fire became inseparable partners. Where there was smoke, there were warm clothes. Where there were warm clothes, people survived. Even in poverty, peasants kept Sunday clothes. The least patched, cleanest garment often dyed a lighter colour, reserved for church, village festivals, or weddings. On special days, women wore white scarves, symbols of purity. Men tied simple embroidered belts, just a few coloured stitches, but a source of pride. Children wore cut-down versions of their parents' old garments, to look more grown up. In the dead of winter, a clean shirt or a bright cloth wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder we still have dignity, despite the cold. People believed clothes held more than warmth. They held the soul. Many families sewed tiny crosses with coloured thread, hidden inside garments. Some mothers tied wooden charms to children's belts, believing they repelled evil winds and spirits. Church hoods were often sprinkled with holy water, so the wearer felt protected in both body and spirit. In faith, clothing wasn't just fabric. It was a talisman against both cold and darkness. Clothing was valuable property. At village markets, people traded not only grain and chickens, but clothes. A good wool tunic could be exchanged for half a season of firewood. A fur cloak could be pawned to borrow seed. Richer families owned a few extra outfits, but they didn't flaunt them. Instead, they sometimes rented out cloaks in winter, a small business of the time. Poor travellers could borrow one and return it in spring. Every thread, every scrap had value. There was no concept of buying new clothes for fun. Garments were made only when truly needed and when materials allowed. Nothing was wasted. Torn shirts, cut into patches, ripped pants, strings salvaged for bundling firewood, old fabric, braided into mats under straw beds, loose wool, stuffed into pillows or packed into shoes, spare leather, turned into belts, pouches, even pot scrubbers. One piece of clothing could live through generations, from father's tunic to son's shirt to grandson's, finally ending as a patched scrap of insulation. Each round of reuse was proof of absolute thrift and ingenuity. Clothing wasn't just material, it was memory storage. A mismatched patch recalled a winter that dragged 2 months too long. A small burn mark told of the night the family almost lost their fire. A frayed hem spoke of a father kneeling in prayer through a plague. Passing clothes down wasn't just handing over fabric, it was handing down survival stories. And so, each garment became a silent chronicle of the family. In the village, clothes were sometimes shared. If someone lost a cloak, a neighbour would lend one. If someone had an extra scarf, they gave it to a weak child. Scraps of cloth gathered together could save a person from freezing to death. There were nights when the whole village sat together, women sewing, men chopping wood. No one asked, "Whose coat is this?" What mattered more was, whose life will this coat save? In those simple acts, clothing became the thread that tied the community together. Today, when we think of fashion, we think of runways, trends, and colours. But for medieval peasants, fashion was only one truth. Clothes were beautiful because they kept you warm. Clothes were precious because they lasted. Clothes were memorable because they helped families survive. No one cared about cuts or styles. They only cared, does it block the wind? Does it shield from the snow? Does it keep my child's breath alive? In the end, when we look back, we see that peasant clothing was a reflection of themselves. Simple, rough, smoky, patched over and over, but resilient, never broken. Winter didn't just test individuals, it tested the entire community. A family might have fire, straw, and wool, but one small accident, losing the fire, a spoiled grain store, a sick member collapsing, and the whole household could vanish. In that reality, community became a second coat, wrapped around each family, keeping them warm not only with human breath but with solidarity. Picture this, a night of howling wind, a blizzard raging. In a tiny house, the fire dies. Despite banking the coals, the ashes cool. The family shivers, knowing without fire they won't live to see morning. Then, the father throws on his cloak, pulls up his hood, and steps outside, stumbling through the snow to a neighbour's house. He knocks, trembling, and asks for a burning ember. And the neighbour, poor and cold as well, still opens the door, takes a glowing coal from the hearth, places it in a clay bowl, and hands it over. That ember didn't just save one family, it carried an unspoken promise. None of us will face winter alone. Fire passing from house to house became an invisible thread, linking the village into a lifeline. Winter wore down the granaries, emptied the pickle jars, shrank the turnips. Some days, a family had nothing but plain water left. But instead of starving in silence, they knocked on another door. In the village, there was a custom: share fire, share food. If one household made porridge, they ladled an extra bowl for the hungry neighbour. Not because they had plenty, they ate less themselves, but because they knew, today we give, tomorrow we may receive. That porridge was thin, sometimes only a few grains and a slice of turnip. But it was proof of community spirit. Sharing life, no matter how little. Winter brought sickness, pneumonia, high fevers, relentless coughs. If the sick were left alone, families could collapse. So the village had its own unspoken system. When one family had someone ill, neighbours came to help. An old woman too weak to move had neighbours stoking her fire and boiling water. A feverish child was carried to an aunt's or cousin's house to sleep in the collective warmth. Sometimes the whole village took turns bringing food, ragged blankets, or scraps of wood just to keep one life breathing. These small acts were lifelines. The sick held in the community's arms, not left to drown in winter. In winter, many tasks became collective work. Chopping wood. One man fell ill. The village split his share of wood cutting. Fixing roofs. Heavy snow threatened collapse, so men climbed up together to mend it. Fetching water. When the well froze, the young men broke ice and carried water for many homes. These jobs were impossible alone, but when done together, they became walls of defense against the cold. Winter wasn't just cold, it brought wild beasts too. Hungry wolves prowled, bears came down from the mountains. A small family couldn't fight them off, but the whole village lit torches, banged drums, and drove them away. Human voices rang through the snowy night, turning solitude into strength. Community protected them not only from cold, but from nature's threats. They understood. Survival meant saving the whole village, not just one household. Beyond physical help, the community gave spiritual strength. On long nights, neighbours gathered around a big fire, telling old stories, singing folk songs. Songs didn't make houses warmer, but they made hearts steadier. Stories of ancestors who survived past winters whispered, "We will survive too." Through those gatherings, the community wove an invisible coat, draped over everyone. A coat made of memory, laughter, and hope. Each family was like a tiny flame, fragile and easy to snuff out. But with community, those flames linked into an endless chain of light. No one was truly strong, but together, the village became a fortress of life. If we see community as the coat wrapped around each family, then next, look closer. Community didn't just share fire and food, it created collective systems, habits, rituals, and unwritten rules that carried the whole village through winter. Many villages had a shared storage, managed by the village council. Each harvest, Families had to contribute a small portion of barley, oats, or dried turnips to this reserve. In winter, when a household ran short, they could request relief food. The storehouse wasn't large, often just a thatched hut with a few jars and crocks, but it symbolized something greater: collective trust. People believed that what they gave today, tomorrow, in times of hardship, the community would return twofold by saving their lives. When those jars of dry food were opened, they released not only the smell of grain, but also the scent of hope. In winter, fieldwork lessened, but the community didn't fall apart. On the contrary, this was when important village gatherings happened. Wood-splitting gatherings. Young men split wood into piles, shared equally among households, prioritizing those with the elderly and children. Roof-mending gatherings. When snow collapsed a roof, the entire village rebuilt it together. Each family contributed straw, wood, and a pair of hands. Winter pig slaughtering. The meat was divided, part offered to the church, the rest shared among households. These weren't just labor, they were survival rituals. People worked, sang, and told stories, turning hardship into a thread of unity. Living with the cold, peasants forged unwritten laws. 1. Never let a neighbor freeze in silence. If a house had no smoke, you had to check. 2. If someone had extra wood, they shared with those who had none. Tomorrow the wind might change, and you would need them too. 3. Children were never abandoned. If parents fell ill, the village cared for their young. 4. No one ate alone when neighbors starved. Even a single turnip had to be split. These laws weren't written, but carved into hearts. Stronger than the Lord's commands, they were the laws of survival. Passing down secrets. The community's survival treasure. Cold weather wisdom was handed down by word of mouth. A grandmother told her grandchild, "When the fire weakens, bury embers in ash and blow them back to life in the morning." A grandfather taught his son, "Never breathe through your mouth in the wind, or your lungs will freeze and kill you." A mother reminded her child, "Stuff fresh straw into your shoes every day, or you'll lose your toes." Each tip was a seed of survival. Alone, it meant little, but when the whole village shared it, these secrets became a collective shield. In winter, the village church was not only a place of prayer but also a communal home. Thick stone walls and high arches sometimes kept more warmth than thatched huts. Families crowded inside during blizzards, sleeping beneath holy statues, sharing ragged blankets. The priest lit candles, read prayers, and comforted. "Believe, spring will come." The flickering lights became symbols of hope in the darkness. The church also stored small amounts of food donated by villagers. When a family was desperate, they knocked on the church door and received dry bread, a spoon of porridge. No one left empty-handed, because mercy too was part of the community. Despite the cold, peasants still held winter festivals. They built a great bonfire in the village centre, gathered to sing, dance, and share bread and ale. The festival didn't make winter warmer, but it kept spirits from freezing. Children laughed, adults forgot hunger for a while. That night, together, no one felt alone. There was once a family whose hearth went out during a storm. The father ran to a neighbour's house, but the wind was so fierce he collapsed in the snow, unable to rise. The neighbour found him, pulled him in, and warmed him with his own body. Then the whole village took turns rekindling the family's fire, giving wood, straw, and blankets. That house survived. And ever since, the story of the neighbour who saved with body heat was retold as a communal lesson. One human breath can save an entire family. The community shared not only resources but also faith. In winter, with death lurking, it was the thought, "I still have my neighbours, I still have my village," that kept despair away. They knew, if they fell, someone would lift them. If they were hungry, someone would share a handful of grain. If their fire died, someone would bring a glowing coal. And if one night they passed away, the community would care for their children. That was the power of community. One great roof covering every small home. Imagine a wool cloak, patched all over, with a brown square of fabric on the hem. To outsiders, just an old coat. But to one family, it was a witness, of a brutal winter. That patch recalled the year snow collapsed their roof, and the whole village rebuilt it. Thick stitches on the cuff told of a father's sickness, when neighbours sewed all night so he had clothes to wear by morning. Smoke that never washed out was the smell of long nights, when the village gathered around the fire, telling stories and singing to forget the cold. Community memory was kept not only in words but in familiar objects. Every stitch, every worn edge whispered, "We survived together." Underscore. In one small village, when night fell, everyone gathered around a great fire. The elders began. Long ago, winters were harsher. One year, even the grain stores ran dry. But by digging roots and fishing under ice together, we survived. Children sat wide-eyed. They weren't just hearing stories. They were learning the lesson. Survival was always tied to community. These tales were passed down, becoming a priceless treasure. Do you see? When the whole village told the same story, the community became a collective memory, teaching each person they lived not just for themselves, but to carry on a shared history. Underscore. In winter, faith bound people tighter. Picture an evening in the village church. Snow raging outside, but inside, candles glowing. The entire village on their knees, praying for winter to pass, praying for children's health. The rituals didn't melt snow, but they warmed hearts. When you heard the voices of the community singing together in a stone church, you knew clearly. You were not alone. Even every winter festival was a collective ritual against despair. People lit a great fire, shared dry bread and barley ale, danced in the snow. Laughter, songs, crude instruments rang out, breaking the deathly silence of winter. Underscore. You might think family was the only refuge, but the community was the larger home. When you were sick, the village healed you. When your fire went out, neighbours gave you coals. When you were hungry, someone split a turnip. Each small act was like a thread, woven into a giant blanket covering the entire village. And with that blanket, each small family survived. Think of it. A selfish person, hoarding food, might live a little longer. But if the entire village acted that way, all would die. When the community shared, the cold could never conquer the human spirit. Underscore. Strangely, despite the harsh winters, medieval peasants left behind no grand castles or epic songs. What they left was a quieter legacy, the strength of community. Tiny villages, leaking thatched roofs, dwindling stores, all endured because people leaned on each other. And that legacy still lives in you today. When you light a coal fire at New Year, when you share a bowl of rice with neighbours, when you sing together on a cold night, that is the echo of the medieval winter. Have you ever thought that in today's world, with heaters, electric blankets, supermarkets full of food, we've forgotten one thing? Humans were born to live together. The story of the medieval winter reminds you that no one can survive alone. You may be rich, you may be strong, but when darkness and cold arrive, it is the community that becomes the last refuge. Today, winter is no longer as frightening as before, but the winter of life still exists. Those times you fail, lose, or feel alone. And just like the peasants of old, you need a community, friends, family, neighbours, to remind you, you are not alone. We will get through this together. Underscore. That is the power of community. And that is today's message for you, wherever. For you live, whatever you do, don't forget that your connection with others is humanity's warmest coat. Outside, snow piles up to your knees, wind whistles through every crack, your little house shudders as if about to collapse. In that suffocating darkness, a single candle flickers on the rough wooden table, becoming the saving light. It cannot light the whole room, nor warm your trembling hands, but for you, it is proof that the darkness has not swallowed everything. That candle is often placed beneath a wooden cross or a small saint statue, the family's most sacred possession. Sometimes the cross is just two scraps of wood tied together. The statue only a crudely carved block, but it carries invisible strength. The power of faith. Looking into that trembling flame, you feel your heart steady against each gust of wind. Every night before bed, your family has a small ritual. Kneeling around the wooden table, father or mother recites a prayer. The words repeat, short and simple, but like a charm of protection. Children close their eyes, hands folded, whispering after their father, "Keep us through this night." You know no one can be sure they will wake when dawn comes. So the prayer becomes a fragile bridge between darkness and light. If the next morning your whole family is still alive, if the fire has not gone out, if your breath is still warm, it's not only thanks to clothes, to wood, to fire, but also to faith that kept your spirit from breaking. You may see in many medieval homes a small altar corner always holding holy water. When someone fell ill, especially a child, the mother dipped her hand and sprinkled drops around the bed. For you today, it may seem symbolic, but for them, it was an invisible wall against cold and demons. A scarf blessed by a priest, a small wooden piece from a holy site, even just a coin engraved with a cross, all were seen as talismans. You would find them hung on children's necks, tucked into men's belts, or tied to the corners of women's cloaks. With death lurking outside, these small objects gave the feeling of an invisible hand watching over you. Not every family was strong enough to fight despair. There were days when illness spread, nights when the fire went out completely. Then neighbours would step in. They brought a burning coal, a bowl of hot porridge, and a prayer. You might see the whole village kneeling together in one cramped house, voices united in prayer. The fire in the hearth flared not only from embers, but from collective faith. In that moment, you knew you were not alone. And when despair lifted, your body felt renewed, not because the temperature rose, but because your heart burned hotter. Communal faith was the invisible hearth. The winter night stretched endlessly. The wind outside made you think death was knocking at the door. Yet inside the smoky house, your father's steady voice reciting prayers filled the air. That rhythm was like a heartbeat, low, steady, enduring. Children drifted to sleep to that sound, buried in straw, believing that when they opened their eyes, dawn would be there. The elderly heard the prayers and felt at peace, as if their souls were held safely in divine hands. And you, as you whispered along, reminded yourself that though storms raged outside, inside your heart, there was still a flame. You may wonder, does prayer really drive away the cold? The answer is no. It doesn't stop snow from falling or wind from howling. But prayer was something essential. The church bell rang on a bleak morning, echoing across the small village. People gathered instantly, cloaks dusted with snow, scarves pulled tight, hurrying toward the thick stone walls. The church stood there, silent yet commanding, like a fortress unmoved by storms. Inside, the stone floor was icy, but at least the vaulted roof kept out the wind. You and your family pressed in, breath turning white in the air, mingling with candle smoke. The flame on the altar seemed to burn brighter, not just because of wax, but because of the dozens of eyes fixed on it. In those eyes were faith and desperate plea. The priest stood, cross in hand. His voice boomed through the hall. This winter will pass like the ones before. God has not abandoned us. Heads bowed. Tears ran down not only from emotion but from relief. Those words pierced through the wall of despair, opening a crack of light in the night. In one corner, someone brought dried bread to offer. It was so hard it needed a knife to cut, but when divided, it became a priceless gift. Each person received a small piece, chewing slowly, stretching the rare sweetness. You gave yours to the child beside you, because here, sharing was the only way to survive. The church also held barrels of dried barley. When a family was broken, the priest scooped out handfuls and pressed them into their hands. Not much, only enough for thin porridge, but enough to keep them alive one more day. And with each handful came the reminder, tomorrow, when you can, return it to the community. It wasn't borrowing, but the circle of faith's cause and effect. Children often heard the story of Saint Martin, the saint who cut his cloak for a beggar. That story became a living lesson. When you saw a child shivering, you untied your scarf and wrapped it around them. You thought less of yourself, because that act carried the image of the saint. For a moment, you too felt part of a miracle. On Christmas Eve, the church blazed with dozens of candles. Hymns soared, drowning out the wind outside. You sat in the crowd, hand in hand with family, eyes closed, letting music and prayer fill your chest. The air was still cold, but your heart burned, as if an unseen fireplace roared within. The church was therefore not only a shelter but a soul. It taught you how to believe, how to share, how to stand firm in darkness. And each time you stepped out of those heavy doors, you carried with you more than warmth, you carried a fire that could never be extinguished. When the blizzard raged all night, the mother quietly took a small box of holy powder and sprinkled a circle around the hearth. You sat nearby, eyes wide, certain that circle would keep out demons and the cold. The fire crackled, its glow reflecting off the white ring on the floor, and in your heart, faith burned stronger than the flames. The father lit a candle and placed it on the window. Outside, the wind howled, snow lashed, but the fragile flame held firm. You watched it sway in the storm, whispering to yourself, if that candle stayed lit, the family would not fall. That tiny light became a silent vow. We will survive. Some families hung ivy branches on their doors, believing it carried the power of eternal life. You touched the green leaves, feeling their softness and vitality, so different from the white wasteland outside. To you, the ivy was proof that nature was not dead. Spring would return. Each week, the villagers gathered to pray. They sang hymns, voices weaving together, rising to the wooden rafters. You sang too, even if your voice was weak and felt wrapped in a great blanket of music. That song didn't drive away the cold winds, but it banished loneliness, a fear greater than frost itself. On the darkest days, the community held a ritual of sowing hope. They carried a dry stalk of wheat, buried it in the snow, and prayed, "Show us spring." You stood there, staring at fields buried under white, but warmth filled your chest. Not because you believed the stalk would sprout at once, but because you knew hope had been planted. On some nights, children roamed the village singing door to door, knocking in small groups, raising their voices with old songs. You joined them, your feet freezing but your heart ablaze. Each time a door opened, each time a family smiled and handed out bread. Or a turnip, your group sang louder. The music spread through the night, turning the village into a glowing island in a sea of snow. These rituals may have been simple, mere customs, but they kept people from collapsing before the darkness. You knew winter would pass, not just with wood and clothes, but with faith kept alive by ritual. When you lay down through the long night, ears still echoing hymns, eyes still seeing the candle in the window, heart still remembering the circle of holy powder by the fire, you were sure, no matter how thick the darkness, light remained in your heart. Underscore, when winter nights ended, the whole village gathered at the home of one who had passed. No one wailed. Instead, they lit candles and placed them around the body. Flames flickered, reflecting on weary but resolute faces. You knelt and prayed with everyone. In that moment, you realized even death could not divide the community, because faith bound them together. The dead were buried in the small graveyard beside the church, rows of snow-covered stones standing silent. Yet every grave bore a wooden cross, and each had hardened drips of wax. Those frozen white trails reminded you, we prayed for them. We did not let them leave in darkness. When a child was born in winter, baptism was held that very night. You stood in the church, shivering, but your eyes lit up as the priest poured holy water on the baby's forehead. In the hymns, you believed that child was protected. Every newborn was proof. Faith guarded not only the past, but opened the door to the future. Yet winter sometimes planted doubt. On certain nights you heard whispers, "If God is real, why let us suffer so?" But just as the thought flickered, the community answered with action. A hand offering a glowing coal, a bowl of porridge split in two, a shared prayer. All told you faith wasn't only in the heavens, but alive in the people around. You. In every home, parents taught their children to recite prayers, even just a short verse. Not for show, but so that when winds battered the door, there was something to cling to. Prayers, with their steady rhythm, were ropes pulling you from despair's abyss. You might not understand every word, but speaking them made you feel warm, and that was what mattered most. Spring festivals came when the snow melted, and the entire village went to the church in thanks. You walked along, your heart lighter, knowing you had survived another winter. With church bells ringing, you felt that faith didn't just let you endure, it turned endurance into victory. Year after year, the ritual repeated, etched deep into collective memory. Faith became an invisible inheritance passed to children. You realized that without it, the village would have vanished in storms long ago. But through faith and unity, they left you not just history, but a lesson. You hear this story today, and you understand. No matter the century, people always need an anchor. It might be religion, belief, or simply trust in each other. But surely, faith is the candle that never dies in the long night. Cold ashes lay still in the hearth. Last night someone forgot to bury the embers under thick ash, or maybe a sudden wind slipped through the cracks and stole the last glow. This morning, when you opened your eyes, it wasn't dawn's light that greeted you, but the shadow of despair. The fire was dead. The cold swept into the house like an invisible enemy. It didn't knock, didn't step, but you felt it everywhere, biting skin, seeping into bone. You shivered, pulling the ragged blanket higher, but there was no warmth left to share. Children curled up in the straw, lips purple. One small body still squirmed, trying to burrow into its mother's chest, but its hands were stiff as stone. The mother, exhausted from holding her child all night, dark circles under her eyes, tried to breathe warmth onto its face, but even her breath turned to white frost, vanishing in vain. The father, trembling, rose and searched the hearth for a surviving coal. His hands dug through ash, scattering grey dust, but found nothing but cold remains. He looked up, eyes hollow, then turned to his family. Just one night, and months of struggle had crumbled. Without fire, the cold claimed dominion at once. The earthen floor turned to ice. Breath thickened, coating the thatch roof in frost. Drops of water fell on your face, reminders that you were losing this war. You heard your older daughter's teeth chattering. She tried to smile, tried to act strong, but her frail body shook uncontrollably. The youngest boy was silent, eyes shut. You touched his cheek, icy cold. He wasn't gone yet, but you knew time was running out. In desperation, the father threw on his cloak and resolved to beg fire from the neighbours. He opened the door, wind slashed in like blades. Stepping out, he bent double as snow whipped across his face. The path vanished in moments, his footprints erased. Each step dragged him deeper into death's abyss. Inside, you and the others clung to each other, but without fire, even shared warmth wasn't enough. Breath pooled briefly, then was swallowed by the cold. The child's head slumped on your shoulder, eyes dull. You shook it gently, whispering, "Hold on. Father will bring back fire." But you heard your own voice tremble, unsure. Time slowed to cruelty. With no hearth light, the house drowned in grey. Each minute, your skin numbed further. Fingers stiffened. Movements grew heavy. You felt your body turning to stone. You remembered your father's warning. Never let the fire die. The words tolled like a funeral bell. For once the flames were gone, nothing stood between your family and death by frost. Fire was more than heat. It was the heart of the home. And when that heart stopped beating, the family faded with it. The door bursts open. Father returns, cloak covered in snow, face purple with cold. He clutches a clay bowl, inside only a few tiny glowing embers. He kneels, sets them in the hearth, blows hard. But the embers are too weak, glowing faintly before dying out. In that moment, you hear Mother's choked sob, not because the fire is gone, but because she knows the last chance has slipped away. Father collapses, gripping the clay bowl, but his hands are so frozen he can no longer feel them. You tremble, clutching your younger sibling's hand. It's ice cold, yet you still hope. You pull the child close, holding tight, as if you could pass on your last bit of warmth. But as you look around, you see the whole family fading. Everyone's eyes are sunken, breaths shallow. The cold doesn't kill you instantly. It torments, erodes, drags you into a half-dreaming haze. In delirium, you find yourself lying in a sunny field, birds singing, warmth all around. But when you wake, it's only an illusion. The house is still dark, and you're still shivering. Outside, the wind howls, like death laughing at you. Inside, every breath grows weaker, and when someone stops shivering, it means the cold has won. The granary lies silent like a tomb. When the lid is lifted, you see only the bare wooden bottom, a few dry barley grains scattered like the last golden dust of hope. Your mother scrapes her hands across the bottom, gathering what she can into her apron, but there are so few it doesn't even fill a palm. The whole family stands around, silent. No one dares speak, but everyone knows. The lifeline is gone. The first day, Mother still cooks a pot of thin porridge, more water than grain, with the musty smell of dried turnip tossed in just to trick the senses. You drink the hot porridge, your stomach feels warmer, but inside you know hunger hasn't left. Everyone pretends to be full. Children smile faintly, adults nod, but their eyes are hollow, burning with hunger. The second day, the porridge is so thin, it's only grey water. Mother divides it evenly, but the youngest cries after drinking, begging for more. Mother shakes her head, tears falling into the bowl, because there is nothing left to give. You bite your lip, torn between pity and helplessness, as if an invisible hand is squeezing your heart. By the third day, you see villagers digging up roots, scraping tree bark to chew. Some boil leather shoes soft, foul-smelling, yet still eaten. You watch and don't dare think about tomorrow, because you know sooner or later your family will face the same. The children grow weaker. No more running in the snow. They sit still, wide eyes dim. One clutches their belly, moaning, "I'm hungry." You turn away, unable to meet that gaze, because you know the answer is only silence. The elderly begin giving up their share. Grandfather secretly slides his bowl toward a grandchild. When caught, he smiles faintly. "I'm not hungry. The children need it more." But you know he's lying. The trembling hands, the empty eyes cannot hide the truth. That night, he lies still, his breathing fading. By morning, he never wakes again. Hunger doesn't only kill by taking energy, it kills by eroding hope. With an empty stomach, your mind no longer thinks of spring, of harvest, of festival songs. All you can think of is a piece of bread, a potato, a spoon of porridge. Hunger turns people into living ghosts, existing only to search for food. You start dreaming of feasts. In dreams, a long table full of meat, fresh bread, wine overflowing. You bite into it, so delicious you cry. But when you wake, your mouth is full of blood, because in your dream you bit your lip until it tore. Hunger turns sleep into torture. The entire village falls into the same fate. When the church bells toll, it's not to call for prayer, it's to announce another death. Mass graves appear under the snow. The living are too weak to dig deep, so only a thin layer of soil covers them. Each grave is a reminder. The granary is empty, hope is gone. You still remember the day Mother shaped the last handful of mouldy flour into a small loaf. The whole family gazed at it like treasure. She sliced it thin, making sure everyone got a piece. When it's your turn, your slice is no bigger than a coin, dry and bitter. But as you chew, tears stream down not because of the taste, but because you know this may be the last piece. Father, in despair, decides to go farther, to find food in the next village. He pulls on his cloak, takes a small knife. The family watches him leave, hearts sinking. A hacking cough rips through the silence of the dark house. At first, just a small cough from the youngest, thought to be nothing. But the cold and hunger turn it into a hidden fire. Within days, their breathing is laboured, chest rising and falling fast, weak moans breaking the long night. You sit beside them, holding their hand, tiny and icy, shaking like a twig in the wind. Mother takes the scarf once blessed by the priest, places it on their chest, whispering prayers. But you know the scarf cannot drive out the cold lodged in their lungs. The child coughs hard, blood mixed with phlegm. The sound echoes through the house, a grim reminder that sickness has come to stay. The next day, Father begins coughing too. He forces a smile, saying it's just smoke. But his voice is hoarse, breath ragged. You see him shiver with each draught, see his purple hands hidden under the cloak. Illness found its way from child to parent, like a clever enemy striking one by one. In the village, disease spreads like poisoned wind. Coughs echo from every home. Each household has someone bedridden, faces flushed with fever, eyes sunken. The stronger care for the sick, but within days, they collapse too. The community slowly turns into a vast hospital with no medicine, no doctors, only helpless prayers. An old woman burns with fever 3 days straight. Neighbours take turns bringing warm water, wiping her brow, but in the end, she passes. They wrap her in an old blanket, bury her quickly under snow. but those who cared for her fall ill in turn. Sharing, once the community's strength, now becomes a bridge for disease. You watch your childhood friends fading in their parents' arms. Some children reduced to skin and bone, gasping until silent. Their mothers' cries shake the village, voices breaking with grief until they too collapse from exhaustion. This pain no longer belongs to single families, it spreads, devouring the whole community. In your house, sickness drains everyone. Mother too weak to cook, even thin porridge, just sitting and clutching her dying child. You want to run for medicine, but you know no one has anything left to give. The houses around you groan the same, each clinging to their last breath. By the 10th day, your father can no longer rise. He lies there, eyes dim, hand trembling to find yours. He whispers, "Live. At least one must live." The words as faint as a breeze, but striking deep into your heart. You nod, tears streaming, but inside you know the promise is nearly impossible. Then comes the moment your younger sibling quietly stops breathing. The house sinks into a dreadful silence. No more coughing, no more moans, only emptiness. You cradle them, trying to pass what little warmth you have, but their body is already too cold. Their death is the tolling bell, a reminder the whole family is nearing the edge. Outside, church bells toll without end. Each ring marks a life lost, but no one has the strength to dig deep graves. Bodies are laid under scraped snow, thinly covered. The white frost becomes the last blanket. The graveyard fills quickly, until many must be buried together in one pit. The cruelest sickness wasn't pneumonia or high fever, it was the spread of despair. When you looked around and saw everyone sick, everyone lying down, everyone coughing hoarsely, you began to believe you too would soon collapse. Faith slowly faded, replaced by resignation, and when hope was gone, death was only a matter of time. In the final days, only a few lonely fires still burned. Many houses no longer sent up smoke. You looked around and felt as if the whole world had stopped breathing. The sickness hadn't just defeated individuals, it had conquered the community. It didn't just take bodies, it shattered the bonds that once held people together. The cost of failing against disease was the disappearance of an entire village. No more songs, no more festivals, no more prayers echoing in the church, only wind howling through abandoned roofs, and beneath the snow, nameless graves piled on one another. And you, if still alive, would walk through those ruins, carrying the horror of memory. The memory that one small mistake, a fire gone out, an empty granary, a lingering cough, was enough to sweep an entire community into eternal darkness. Underscore. When winter finally retreated, when the pale sun shone down on melting snow, you stepped outside, feeling as if you had returned from a battlefield. But this wasn't victory. This was survival, scarred and broken. You looked around the village and saw those still standing, all like ghosts. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, hair matted, many gone white in just one winter. The young looked no different than the old. And you realized, survival didn't mean whole. Survival meant carrying marks that never faded. Underscore. The cold left permanent scars on bodies. A man lost 3 fingers to frostbite. He held up the twisted hand and forced a laugh, though his eyes carried tragedy. A woman lost her foot, now limped on a wooden crutch. A neighbour's boy lost his hearing to chronic ear infection in the freeze. You too bore scars. Knees swollen from joint pain, hands that froze with every gust even in spring. Coughs lasting months, making you feel your lungs had been eaten away by winter wind. Your body became a living map of winter's wounds. Each time you saw your reflection in water, the hollow face staring back was unrecognizable. Eyes once bright, now sunken, gaze weary. You thought, this is no longer me. This is one who has walked out of hell. Underscore. If the body carried outer scars, the mind carried inner ones that never healed. The sound of wind whistling through cracks instantly brought back the night the fire died. The image of your family huddled in darkness, the frozen hand of your younger sibling, your mother's stifled sobs, all surged back. Each time the hearth cooled, your heart raced, terrified history would repeat. Every spring meal, even a bowl of porridge with a few beans, made your hands tremble. You remembered the empty granary, your father collapsing in the snow with an empty sack. Even when stores were full, you felt uneasy. terrified they would run dry again. Hunger etched itself in your mind like a curse, and whenever someone coughed, your spine froze. A dry cough to others was ordinary, but to you it was a death knell. You remembered the house filled with rasping coughs, bodies burning with fever. The night your sibling gasped for breath, then went silent. Those sounds became hauntings. You could never hear a cough without dread. It wasn't only you who carried memory. Every survivor did. You saw a neighbor missing half a hand, fumbling to tie his shoes. You saw the woman who once sang at the harvest festival, her voice now hoarse, never to sing again. You saw children, once wild on the fields, now gaunt, quiet, eyes older than their years. Each person was a mirror of pain. Looking at them, you saw yourself. Looking at you, they saw themselves. No stories needed telling. The eyes alone spoke enough. In earlier years, spring meant festivals. But that year, when snow melted, no one sang. No one had the strength to dance or laugh. The drums were put away, the choir silenced. Instead, there was heavy quiet, as if everyone knew their laughter had been stolen by winter. You sat on the doorstep, the spring sun spilling gold, but your heart couldn't warm. The joy that should have bloomed with sprouting trees was replaced by emptiness. Winter had etched itself into your soul, turning you into someone who knew survival but no longer knew joy. At night, you still woke with a start. In dreams, you were back in the dark house, fire dead, wind roaring. You rushed to the hearth, tried to stir the ashes, but your hands shook, and the embers died again. You turned and saw your family huddled, eyes hollow. You screamed, but no one heard. Each time you woke drenched in sweat, though spring had come, you gasped for breath, hands cold, heart pounding. The dream repeated, reminding you that you had never truly escaped winter. You carried it with you, like a clinging ghost. Faith once lit the way, but after that winter, many wavered. Some kept praying, believing God spared them to testify. Others whispered, if he exists, why let us suffer so? You too stood between two paths. One side offered prayers of comfort, the other, memories too real to believe in miracles. Each candle you lit warmed you, but also tormented you, because its light could not erase the sight of loved ones lost in darkness. You realized your body, with every scar and memory, was living proof of that winter. You didn't need to tell much, because anyone looking into your eyes could see you had been through hell. Every scar, every cough, every frozen hand reminded you survival was never free. You had paid in blood, in tears, in loss, and now you carried that cost for life. You walked past your neighbor's house. The door broken, roof half collapsed, inside dark. No children's laughter, no smoke rising, only wooden bowls scattered on the floor, old shoes in the corner. The house stood silent as a grave. You walked further. Second house, third house. The same. Some showed signs of brief return, but most stood empty, as though winter had swallowed their souls. You realized the once bustling community, once sharing every coal and bowl of porridge, was now just a ghost of itself. You stopped at the graveyard beside the church. The soil damp, mouldy, melted snow, revealing fresh mounds. Many covered only with thin dirt, a stick for a marker. Some graves had no names, only unfeeling stones. You read the hurriedly carved names, the friend you once played with, the man who lent you coal, the woman who sang at autumn festival, all now under the cold earth. The graveyard grew each day, while the village shrank. Each new mound brought church bells, but even the priest was gone. No one left to say the prayers. The bells turned into the community's weeping, reminding you that death had won. Once. The church was refuge, fortress of faith. Now its heavy wooden doors stayed shut. Inside, candles long gone cold, dust thick on the altar, cobwebs covering the corners. No choir, no prayers. The church stood there, a corpse of stone. You entered, sat on the wooden pews. The echo of your footsteps made you shiver. You remembered winter nights when this place was bright, alive with hymns and prayers. Now silence crushed you. You understood. When the community stopped praying together, the soul of the village died too. You met a few survivors, thin, hollow-eyed. They spoke little, voices cracked. They were no longer themselves. A woman who once told jokes now whispered only a few words. A man who once led wood-splitting sat motionless, staring far away, and you realized you, too, had changed. Looking at them, you saw collapse not just in houses, but in souls. A community once bound by laughter, feasts, and sharing, now bound only by collective pain. Underscore. You saw a few children wandering, eyes sunken, huddled under eaves. Their parents lay in the graveyard. No one had the strength to take them in. Everyone struggled to live. They survived on scattered grains, leftover turnips, rare kindness from those who still had food. Each time you looked at them, you saw the village's future vanish. Because if the children weren't raised, if no next generation came, the village would disappear completely. You realized the long-term cost of failure wasn't just today's deaths, but tomorrow's silence. Underscore survivors began leaving. They packed what little remained, a blanket, a few bowls, some seeds. They left the village that raised them, seeking other lands where fire, grain, and faith might still exist. You watched families depart, their shapes fading into spring mist. You knew they had no choice. The village was drained, fields abandoned, granary empty, church silent. Staying meant dying. One day you too would leave, but the thought tore at you. Because if you left, the village, once full of laughter, once a common home, would vanish forever. Underscore time passed, nature reclaimed what was left. Weeds covered collapsed roofs, vines climbed church walls. The graveyard too was buried by snow and rain, erasing rotted wooden crosses. People from other villages said once a community lived here, once there were bright festivals. But when they passed, they saw only ruins, lifeless silence. The name of the village faded, erased from maps, forgotten by outsiders. Only you and a few survivors remembered, carrying the images in your hearts. But memory weighed heavy as stone. It was no longer pride. It was a wound that would never heal. Underscore. The community had once been a shelter, a great home. Now it fractured into scattered individuals. People no longer trusted as before. When hungry, when cold, when disease spread, each one had to fight alone. Solidarity had been torn apart. You remembered the days when the whole village shared porridge, sang by the fire. Now those images felt like a distant dream. The community was no longer us, only me and others. And that was the most painful collapse of all. Do you remember the orphans, huddling under the eaves when winter passed? Many were taken in by villagers, others wandered and formed small groups. They no longer had parents, but they had memories, and those memories became the harshest teacher. Underscore. The generation that survived the deadly winter began to pass down unwritten laws to their children. These laws weren't written on paper, not hung on walls, but carved deep into collective memory. Never let the fire die. Before sleep, everyone must bury the coals well. Children were taught this as their first lesson in life, more important than learning words. Never let the granary go empty. After every harvest, no matter how little, a portion had to be set aside. Even in hunger, it could not all be eaten. Restraint became instinct. Never ignore a cough. Every cough was treated as a warning bell. The sick were wrapped in blankets, placed near the fire, and watched over in turns. These rules were repeated across generations. Children learned from parents, grandchildren from grandparents. Gradually, they became a living cultural legacy, a treasure of experience bought with blood and tears. Underscore. Not only laws, but fears were passed down. You grew up with chilling stories told by the elders around the fire. The village wiped out, the night the fire died, the empty granary, the plague that spread. You shivered listening, but you also learned something vital. Life is fragile, and only preparation, unity, and resilience can save you from winter's claws. The next generation inherited not only land, but collective memory. That memory became an invisible shield, making them more cautious, more enduring, fearful but also hopeful. Underscore. The tragic winter made many question God. Some turned away, others believed even more. But in the end, faith did not disappear. It only changed form. You saw in the village, besides the church, People set up small home altars, where they lit candles each night, not only to pray, but to remember the dead. They began to see the memory of ancestors as sacred as God himself. Thus, the new generation didn't just pray, but also commemorated. Their faith didn't only reach upward to the heavens, but also backward to the past, to those who lay beneath the snow. And this gave them strength. They believed they were living on for those who had fallen. As years passed, the village, or rather, the fragments left of it, began to revive the spring festival. But the festival was no longer the same. No noise, no overflowing wine, no dancing all night. Instead, a solemn ritual. People lit candles around the cemetery, recited the names of the dead, then shared a simple meal. You sat among the crowd, listening to names echo, each name like a knife, but also like a promise. You understood, this festival wasn't for joy, but for remembrance. To remind that life today was bought by yesterday's sacrifice. And it was that remembrance that kept the surviving community from breaking apart. It turned the festival into a bridge between past and future. The young who survived that winter carried fear, but also unusual strength. They valued each grain of barley, each flame, each prayer. They weren't wasteful, not carefree like the children before. Every step they took was cautious, every word heavy. But because of that, when they grew up, they became the hardest generation. They turned obsessions into strength. They built sturdier houses, dug deeper granaries, shared food more fairly. From darkness, they learned to create light. You looked at them and understood. The legacy of winter was not only sorrow but inherited strength. Over time, what you and your generation lived through turned into stories. The old told their grandchildren. Long ago, there was a winter that wiped out a whole village. Children shuddered, but they learned the lesson. Those stories became folklore, perhaps embroidered, perhaps blurred, but their core spirit never changed. Never forget how fragile life island. And you knew, once the story became legend, it rose beyond personal tragedy to become humanity's shared legacy. As you grew old, looking back, you realized the most important thing wasn't clothes, nor granaries, nor fire. What kept you alive through winter was the community. Without neighbors bringing embers, you'd have died when the fire went out. Without a bowl of shared porridge, you'd have fallen when the granary emptied. Without common prayer, you'd have lost hope when sickness came. The deepest lesson you passed down wasn't how to keep fire, but how to keep each other. And that is the eternal legacy. You close your eyes, hearing spring winds sweep across the fields. But in that wind, you still hear the whistle of the winter long ago. The wound will never vanish, but it reminds you, you survived, and you must tell the tale. When you say to the next generation, never let the fire die, never let the granary go empty, never abandon each other. These are not just instructions, but vows carved with blood and tears. And when night falls, and a child lights a candle at home, the trembling light shining on an innocent face, you know the story is complete. Winter may return, but memory, rules, and faith have become weapons. That is the long-term consequence. Winter killed hundreds, but left in humanity's heart a lesson that never dies, that people can only survive by holding on to each other, and from the harshest darkness, the strongest light is born. On the legendary peak of Olympus, among the eternal white clouds and the thunder that shook the skies, a cry rang out, not the cry of mortals, but of a god just born. That child was Ares, son of Zeus, the lord of the skies, and Hera, the majestic queen of all beings. His birth was not wrapped in gentle light, but marked by the roar of storms, the flash of lightning tearing across the heavens, and the scent of blood that fate had decreed. From his earliest days, Ares revealed a nature unlike any other. While other gods sought joy in art, love, or wisdom, Ares was drawn to the ferocity of combat. The child did not smile at the sound of music, but his eyes lit up at the clash of steel. It is said that before he could even speak, Ares clutched a small bronze blade in his tiny hand, and no one could pry it away. Zeus looked upon his son with both pride and unease. Pride, because Ares was strong, fierce, and unlike any other child. Unease, because Zeus knew that such savagery was a seed of chaos, something that could never be controlled. Hera, however, the proud mother, loved Ares with a blind devotion. She held him close, whispering, "You are my fire, my strength. Let no one extinguish you." That love nurtured in Ares an untamed arrogance. But Ares was not like Athena, his sister, who also bore the title of a war god. Athena was born from the wisdom of Zeus, from reason and clarity of mind. Ares was born from blood and fury, from the darkness of storms. They were opposites. One was the art of strategy, the other a hunger for slaughter. As a child, Ares roamed the meadows of Olympus, chasing wild beasts, crushing their bones with his bare hands. He would sit for hours upon jagged rocks, gazing down at the mortal world, where tribes fought over scraps of land and drops of water. Each time he saw blood spilled, Ares laughed the laugh of a child, but already soaked in madness. The other gods avoided him. Apollo deemed him a savage. Artemis scorned his waste of blood. Even Hermes, sly and playful, refused to join his games, for they always ended in wounds and tears. This only made Ares more violent. He learned to stand alone, to wield his rage as the only weapon to assert his existence. And so, from the very beginning, the fate of Ares was clear. He was not a god of love, nor of wisdom, but the god of war, the one who carried within him the song of blood and steel. Ares looked down at the world and saw the small tribes fighting over every drop of water, every patch of land. Humans were fragile, weak, yet in Ares's eyes, they were as enticing as a new game. He did not wish to bless them, nor protect them. What Ares craved was to see them slaughter one another, blood soaking the earth, souls torn from their bodies amidst screams that split the skies. He descended to the mortal realm, not in divine radiance, but clad in bronze armor, gripping a long spear and a blood-red shield. 4 war horses with manes of fire pulled his chariot, each step leaving scorched marks upon the ground. Ares' arrival was not salvation's light, but a nightmare that made every tribe tremble. In a desolate valley, 2 tribes once quarrelling over a single small stream had now become bloodthirsty enemies. Ares stepped into their midst, his eyes glowing like burning coals. He spoke no word, only drove his spear into the ground. From where its tip struck, the earth cracked, and the imagined stench of fresh blood rose, stirring the wildest instincts of humankind. Warriors who hesitated just moments before now roared and charged at one another in uncontrollable fury. Ares moved through the battlefield like a storm. He did not need to slay them all, just a touch of his hand turned fear into madness. The weak trembled and fled. The strong became beasts, swinging axes and spears, no longer knowing friend from foe. The clash of steel on steel, the crack of bones, the tearing of flesh all blended into a symphony that Ares adored. He lifted his face to the heavens, letting the blood splatter across him, and laughed like thunder itself. To Ares, this was a feast. Humans were the prey, and the battlefield was his endless banquet. Yet not all bent to his frenzy. Some warriors struggled against the temptation, clinging to reason in their burning eyes. Ares scorned them, believing those who calculated and restrained themselves unworthy of war. To him, war was pure only when drowned in blood and violence with no reason, no justice. When the battle ended, the ground was buried in corpses, and the small stream ran crimson red. Ares sat upon his chariot, calmly watching the flowers and grass stained in blood, and he knew he had planted the first seed. From then on, humankind would no longer see war as a rare calamity, but as destiny itself. Once blood was spilled, it would never cease. From that small conflict, rumours of a god bathed in blood spread quickly. People whispered that if the dust of battle rose like a crimson cloud, Ares was there. Every gust of wind carrying the metallic stench, every night quivering with the sound of horses' cries, these were his signs. In many places, people prayed to Ares not for victory, but so that their enemies' blood would flow even more. They believed that if they offered sacrifices with knives and hot blood, he would grant them stronger hands and fiercer rage. Yet others trembled in fear, knowing Ares chose no side. He might favour them today, only to hand his spear to their foes tomorrow. Ares' chariot never rested. He roamed across the early Greek lands, setting fire in the hearts of tribes, kings, and warriors alike. Without cause, without name, he turned small quarrels into wars, disputes into massacres. And from that, mankind grew accustomed to blood, to corpses, to grasping weapons from childhood. Each time a child picked up a stick to strike his friend, each time a young man sharpened his will to kill a neighbor, Ares smiled. For he knew, once the first flame had been lit, humanity would never escape the endless spiral of blood and fire. The more Ares spread slaughter across the mortal world, the more he provoked Athena's fury. She did not oppose war, for she herself was the goddess of battle. But while Ares drowned in blind bloodlust, Athena saw war as the art of intellect, where victory must be earned through strategy, not meaningless killing. When Ares rode his divine chariot to sow chaos, Athena often descended to guide those who could think. She gave them the will to hold their formations, the cunning to lay sieges, and the clarity to remain calm in fire and blood. And this very intervention made Athena the natural opposite of Ares, two streams of blood, two ideals, flowing in the same river of war, yet forever clashing. Many times, the two gods confronted each other right on the battlefield. Ares, clad in blazing red armor, charged like a wild beast, while Athena, with her shining aegis shield, stood firm as a wall of bronze. When Ares' spear came crashing down, Athena did not counter with brute strength. Instead, she angled her shield, turned her body, and used her wit to overturn the tide. A single glance from her could steady trembling warriors back into discipline, while Ares' roar only drove them into chaos. Homer in the Iliad recorded one such fierce encounter. When Ares stood with the Trojans, Athena descended to protect the Greeks. Diomedes, the brave warrior, was granted strength and eyes to see the gods by Athena herself. As Ares stormed forward like a hurricane of blood, Diomedes, with Athena guiding him, thrust his bronze spear straight into Ares' belly. The war god's scream thundered across the heavens, immortal blood pouring onto the earth, staining the sky red. Ares writhed, then fled back to Olympus to heal, while Athena stood tall, her eyes burning with contempt. That moment became an unshakable humiliation for Ares, a god of war, struck down by a mortal under Athena's protection. Enraged, he returned to Olympus, weeping before Zeus, accusing Athena of insulting him. But Zeus only shook his head, scolding Ares as a madman, the most detestable of all his children. Those words cut into Ares' fragile pride like a blade, fueling his hatred for Athena even further. Athena, on the other hand, did not despise Ares as a personal enemy. She saw him instead as the embodiment of foolishness. In her eyes, Ares was a meaningless storm, something that had to be contained so humanity would not be swallowed by chaos. Thus, every time Ares spilled blood, Athena sought to restore reason to those still capable of thought. Among the Greek city-states, this divide was plain to see. In Sparta, Ares was honored, for the Spartans lived for war. In Athens, Athena was the protector, symbol of wisdom and civilization. The rivalry between the two gods was not just myth, but a reflection of two paths, one where intellect commanded war, the other where violence ruled the battlefield. Ares never forgave Athena. In every battle, he sought to ruin her strategies, to ignite madness in human hearts and drown out reason. But Athena, calm-eyed, always countered with wisdom and resolve. Their struggle spanned centuries, turning humanity's battlefields into a divine chessboard, where Ares and Athena played a game without end. Though defeated many times, Ares never stopped. He would rather suffer humiliation before all Olympus than abandon blood and steel. For he knew, as long as humankind existed, war would burn, and as long as war burned, he would still have the chance to defeat Athena. After the bloody battles, when the clash of steel faded and the battlefield reeked only of death, Ares still found no peace. He was addicted to fire and blood, yet even the god of war could not live forever on slaughter alone. In the brief moments when night fell and the war horses ceased their cries, Ares felt a hollow emptiness no carnage could fill. And it was that emptiness that drew him to another flame, the flame of love, embodied in the radiant form of Aphrodite. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, was born from the foaming waves of the sea. She was the perfect opposite of Ares, soft, alluring, yet powerful. If Ares was the fire of destruction, Aphrodite was the fire of temptation, burning souls with desire and passion. When Ares first caught sight of her smile, all the savagery in his heart felt trapped, as though his own spear had turned against him. They found each other in secret. Aphrodite was the wife of Hephaestus, the crippled, gruff smith god who lived among the flames of his forge. Their marriage was arranged by Zeus, but it lacked love. Hephaestus, with his twisted frame, could never touch Aphrodite's proud heart. Ares, on the other hand, strong, fierce, relentless, was the one who could set her ablaze with passion. At first, their meetings were brief, hidden under the moonlight. But as time passed, the fire grew stronger. They loved recklessly, defying everything. Ares found in Aphrodite what blood and steel could never give him: softness that soothed his rage, a lure that made him forget the shame of defeat, and the strange sympathy of another bound and scorned. Aphrodite, in turn, found in Ares a lover who burned with abandon so unlike the coldness of Hephaestus or the restraint of the other gods. But love could not remain hidden forever. Helios, the sun god, with eyes that pierced every shadow, caught them entwined in her golden palace. He wasted no time and revealed the affair to Hephaestus. And so, in his blazing forge, the smith god devised a cunning revenge. Hephaestus forged a golden net so fine it was nearly invisible, yet unbreakable. One night, as Ares and Aphrodite gave in to passion, he cast the net over them, binding them to the bed. They struggled, but there was no escape. The cold laughter of Hephaestus rang out, summoning all the gods of Olympus. Zeus, Poseidon, Hermes, Apollo, all came to witness. Ares, the terror of the battlefield, lay naked in the net, his face burning red with shame. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was mocked for her brazen betrayal. Laughter echoed across Olympus, marking one of the most humiliating moments of Ares' life. And yet, that humiliation did not kill their love. Once freed from punishment, Ares and Aphrodite still sought each other. The more forbidden it became, the hotter it burned. Together, they bore children, each embodying the strange union of war and love. Phobos, the embodiment of fear; Deimos, the embodiment of terror; Harmonia, the embodiment of harmony, an ironic paradox born of chaotic love; Eros, the god of passionate love, whose arrows would later make both mortals and gods fall helplessly in desire. These children stood as proof of their defiant love, not pure, not blessed, but powerful enough to shape even the most opposite forces within the human soul. When Ares went to war, Phobos and Deimos rode at his side, spreading terror among soldiers. When Aphrodite smiled, Eros followed, loosing arrows that toppled even the bravest heroes into love's snare. And when fragile peace flickered, Harmonia reminded humankind that even from violence and desire, moments of balance could be born. Though mocked, their passion never died. Ares and Aphrodite became symbols of two flames bound together, the fire of war and the fire of love. Both burned, both destroyed, but together they made life more intense, more consuming. On blood-soaked battlefields, when Ares raised his spear high, Aphrodite's shadow seemed to linger behind him, a reminder that war and love can never be separated. And when Aphrodite smiled to captivate a mortal heart, in her eyes flickered Ares' gaze, the gaze of a flame that never dies. When the drums of war thundered before the walls of Troy, all Olympus turned its gaze to the mortal world. This war was not only a clash between men, but a chessboard where the gods themselves contended. In Homer's epic Iliad, the name of Ares appears often but not with glory. Instead, with scorn, even hatred. Ares sided with the Trojans, not for loyalty, not for justice, but simply because he hungered for blood. Wherever smoke rose and screams erupted, Ares rushed in like a beast scenting prey. On the battlefield of Troy, he appeared in blazing red armor, riding his divine chariot drawn by 4 fire-breathing horses, with his sons Phobos and Deimos beside him, sowing terror in every Greek warrior's heart. The Trojans prayed to Ares, but not out of reverence. They knew the god of war could grant them frenzy, yet could just as easily abandon them. Their prayers were filled with fear. "O Ares, let the blood of our enemies soak the earth before ours." And the Greeks, whenever they saw his chariot approach, they shuddered, not with respect, but with dread. On Olympus, Zeus frowned as he looked down. He did not favor his son. In the Iliad, Zeus thundered at Ares, "You are the god I hate most of all. You delight only in strife, in chaos, with no reason or sense." The curse was no passing remark, but a truth laid bare. Ares was not honored like Athena, not beloved like Apollo, nor as respected as Poseidon. He was nothing but a figure drenched in blood, wandering battlefields, despised even by his own father. Athena, once more, became his direct rival. Amid the fires of Troy, she stood firmly with the Greeks, granting them strategy and clarity amid the chaos. When Ares appeared, Athena did not hesitate to confront him. The climax came when she guided the warrior Diomedes. She placed her hand upon his shoulder and gave him eyes to see the gods. And when Ares charged forward in bloodlust, thinking to crush a mere mortal, Diomedes thrust his bronze spear, guided by Athena, deep into Ares's belly. The scream of the war god shook the valley, like lightning splitting the sky. Immortal blood poured forth, red as sunset, soaking into the soil of Troy. Ares writhed, collapsed, and fled the battlefield, soaring back to Olympus to weep before Zeus. That sight became an eternal stain. A mortal, shielded by Athena, had brought Ares down. The other gods looked on with contempt. Hermes whispered mockery. Apollo shook his head in disdain. The god of war, who spread terror among mortals, now cried and whined to his father like a wounded child. Homer spared no insult. In the Iliad, Ares is called the bane of mankind, greedy for blood, knowing nothing of justice. If Athena embodied righteous war, Ares was meaningless frenzy. He was not invoked for victory, but remembered as a nightmare. The Greeks knew if they called on Ares, he might grant them savage strength, but he would also drive them mad, turning them into beasts that slaughtered endlessly, friend and foe alike. Yet, even despised, Ares endured, for he was the embodiment of a truth no one could deny. Mankind does not fight with reason alone, but with violent instinct. They could admire Athena, but in moments of sheer terror, it was Ares's frenzy that made them rise and fight to the death. And so, throughout the Iliad, Ares appears as both terrifying and pitiful. Terrifying, because he could shake the battlefield with a single roar. Pitiful, because even his own parents and kin despised him. Mortal heroes like Achilles and Hector were praised more than Ares, for they fought for honor, for homeland, while the god of war fought only for blood. To the Greeks, Ares was not a bringer of victory, but a reminder that war always has its dark side. He was the looming shadow that made all shiver, yet none wished to call protector. If Athena was the light of strategy, Ares was the darkness of instinct. And in the Iliad, that darkness was exposed, making the god of war one of the most reviled figures in all of Greek mythology. From his forbidden love with Aphrodite, Ares fathered children unlike any others. They were not gentle offspring, but living embodiments of the deepest fears within the human soul. Beside the blazing chariot of Ares, two figures always rode, Phobos and Deimos. Phobos, the dread of fear, Deimos, the terror of panic. They needed no swords, no spears. Their very presence was enough to make armies tremble, weapons in hand suddenly heavy as stone. When the war chariot thundered across the battlefield, Phobos breathed shivers into enemy hearts, until they fled, while Deimos clouded their vision in hysteria, shattering even the mightiest armies before blades ever clashed. Alongside them, Ares' chariot carried yet another spectre, Enyo, the goddess of destruction, who sowed chaos in every fortress. Legend said that whenever a city burned, whenever blood flooded like rivers, Enyo was dancing in the ashes. Some called her Ares' sister, others his companion, no one knew for certain. But wherever Ares appeared, Enyo was often there, like the shadow of his insatiable nature. Ares' legacy was not only supernatural, he seeded bloodlines among mortals too. The Greeks believed that Ares himself was the father of the warrior women known as the Amazons, a tribe at the edges of the Greek world where women bore bows, mounted horses, and fought as fiercely as men. Born of Ares' fury, they carried in their hearts an unyielding will. With weapons in hand, they defied every barrier and law placed upon women. To the Greeks, the Amazons were both terrifying and alluring, the living embodiment of Ares' blood. There were other children too, marked by strange natures. Harmonia, the opposite of her siblings, was the goddess of harmony. Her very existence was a paradox. From the chaotic love of Ares and Aphrodite came a goddess of unity. Yet that paradox made her fate tragic. She married Cadmus and helped found Thebes, but misfortune haunted her life, as though the shadow of Ares still clung to her destiny. Whispers spread that these children were not only Ares' blood, but reflections of the human spirit itself. When men raised their weapons, Phobos and Deimos stirred within their hearts. When cities fell, Enyo danced in the rubble. When women warriors drew their bows, the Amazons lived again. And when mortals dreamed of peace amid smoke and fire, Harmonia walked forward, though always trembling, knowing such peace could never last. Ares did not raise his children with love. He did not hold them, did not guide them. He let them loose, like streams of blood flowing from the wounds of the cosmos. They grew on the horror men unleashed, and with every scream, every drop of blood spilled, they grew stronger. For Ares, that was a legacy worth pride. He needed no throne, no jewels. He left the world immortal shadows, names that would haunt mankind until the very end. Phobos, Deimos, Enyo, the Amazons, Harmonia, children born of love, of desire, and of fire and blood. Heracles, the mortal son who carried the blood of Zeus, was a hero. Even the gods themselves had to respect. His strength was forged through 12 immortal labours, slaying the Nemean lion, capturing Cerberus, cleansing the stables of King Augeas in a single day. But because he was born of Zeus, Heracles became the one Ares despised most. For in him, Ares saw the opposite of himself, strength bound with willpower, not blind madness. The chance to clash came when Heracles, on one of his campaigns, killed Cycnus, the son of Ares. Cycnus was infamous, lying in wait along the roads, murdering travellers, and offering their skulls to his father's temple. When Heracles defeated and slew him, his blood spilled on the ground, and Ares roared so loudly the heavens shook with fury. Without warning, Ares descended to earth, armour blazing, spear aflame, eyes burning red with rage. He swore to crush Heracles and avenge his son. His chariot thundered forward, Phobos and Deimos cheering, pouring fear into mortal hearts. But Heracles did not tremble. He stood firm, gripping his bow and club, his gaze calm, as if he had awaited this moment. The clash erupted like thunder. Ares hurled his spear, the gust tearing the air apart. But Heracles shifted aside, the spear plunging into the ground and shaking the valley. Heracles lifted his club and struck with such force that rocks shattered. The impact rang like an earthquake. Ares' armour dented, his godly body flung back. Ares could not believe a mortal had driven him back. Roaring like a beast, he charged again, slamming his shield toward Heracles. But Heracles, guided by Athena, Ares' eternal foe, dodged with skill. Athena stood at a distance, her eyes shining like stars, whispering clarity into Heracles' mind to withstand the frenzy. In a decisive moment, Heracles drew his bow, fitting a bronze-tipped arrow to the string. This arrow was no ordinary one, it carried Athena's blessing, sharp enough to wound a god. As Ares stormed forward like a raging tempest, Heracles pulled the string taut and loosed. The arrow tore through the air, piercing Ares' thigh. Immortal blood sprayed forth, crimson as fire, soaking the earth. Ares' scream thundered like lightning, stunning soldiers on both sides. He fell to one knee, his eyes blazing with hatred, but pain forced him to retreat. From Olympus, Zeus witnessed everything. Though he did not love Ares, he would not allow his mortal son to slay a god. Just as Heracles raised his bow for a second shot, a bolt of lightning split the skies, striking between them, forcing Ares to withdraw. Humiliated, Ares staggered back to Olympus, his wound bleeding godly fire, his heart boiling with vengeance. He had once fallen to Diomedes, but that had been under Athena's hand. This time, before Heracles, he felt utterly disgraced, as though Olympus itself conspired against him. From then on, Ares and Heracles stood as opposing forces. Ares hated Heracles not only for the death of Cycnus, but because the hero was living proof that mortals, with strength and will, could challenge the gods. That truth pierced the fragile pride of the war god deeper than any arrow. Heracles in turn did not boast. He knew Ares was still a god, immortal and undying. Yet he also understood a truth. The god of war was not invincible, and that realization planted in mankind a belief that even nightmares named Ares could be conquered. From then, Ares' name was tied not only to blood and fear, but to his defeats at mortal hands. Each wound, each scream, each retreat carved into the epics, making the god of war a figure both terrifying and tragic, immortal, yet more vulnerable than ever. Though Ares was often scorned in the great epics, mankind could never truly deny his presence. On the battlefield, When blood soaked the earth and human bones piled into mounds, all knew it was the mark of the war god's passing. And by instinct, mortals both feared and prayed to him, for they understood that even if he did not grant justice, Ares still held the key to life and death in his hands. In Sparta, Ares was not only revered but became part of the very soul of the people. The Spartans saw war as life itself, the only way to prove one's worth. They raised children on iron discipline, training them from the age of 7, so that when grown, each Spartan warrior was a living weapon of war. For them, Ares was a guardian, the very model of unyielding strength. Their offerings to Ares were often drenched in blood, animal sacrifices, and sometimes even prisoners, given with the belief that blood would please him, and in return, he would grant them an unstoppable frenzy in battle. The Spartans built many temples to Ares, one of which held a statue of the god bound in iron chains. They believed that by chaining the god of war within their city, they could keep his fiery wrath on their side, preventing him from abandoning them for their enemies. That image carried both reverence and superstition. They loved Ares, yet feared he might depart at any moment. In contrast, Athens gave Ares no grand honour. The Athenians adored Athena, the goddess of wisdom, their city's protector. Yet even in that capital of intellect, there stood a hill named for Ares, the Areopagus. There, the city's council gathered to judge great trials, especially bloody crimes like murder. To place justice under the name of Ares was a reminder that violence and blood could never be separated from human life. That hill became a dual symbol, tied to the god of war, but also to mankind's effort to restrain savagery with law and justice. Beyond Sparta and Athens, in many parts of Greece, Ares still had temples and festivals. In Thebes, he was invoked in wars against ancient enemies. In Argos, people offered animal blood to beg Ares to break their foes' formations, yet his worship was always laced with dread. He was never seen as a companion, but as a beast that had to be appeased. In songs, Ares was rarely praised with beautiful words. Even in sacrifices, prayers to him lacked the sweetness offered to Apollo or Demeter. To Apollo, they prayed for light. To Demeter, for harvests. But when calling Ares' name, the plea was, "Make my hand steady when I swing my sword. Strike fear into my enemy's heart before he strikes me." These were not prayers for prosperity, but desperate cries for survival. This revealed Ares' true place in Greek thought. He was not a god of love, nor of abundance, but a storm that had to be contained. Men did not love him, but they could not deny that without him, war would lose its primal power. And so, temples, festivals, and bloody sacrifices continued for centuries. In the smoke of incense, in the cries of the desperate, in the streams of hot blood spilling on stone, Ares smiled. Though despised in poetry, he still lived in the daily life of mortals, creatures forever caught between fear and bloodlust. After Homer's epics echoed across Greece, the image of Ares was carved into collective memory as a god both feared and despised. The Greeks never fully abandoned him, yet they never truly loved him either. To them, Ares was the bringer of blood and fire, the scream of bloodlust, not the song of victory. But when Greek mythology was absorbed by Rome, a strange transformation took place. The name Ares gave way to Mars, and the god of war took on an entirely new face. The Romans, unlike the Greeks, built their entire civilization on military strength. Their empire expanded by sword and spear, by disciplined legions, by the straight roads that carried armies to conquer the world. In that mindset, Mars was not only the god of war, but also the father of their nation. They believed Mars was the father of Romulus, and Remus, the twin brothers raised by a she-wolf, who would go on to found mighty Rome. Thus, Mars was no longer a senseless butcher of blood, but the very root of Roman identity. In Roman temples, Mars appeared regal and commanding. They built for him the Temple of Mars, Altar Mars the Avenger, where emperors prayed before leading their armies to war. No one mocked Mars, no one called him meaningless. Instead, Mars embodied Roman strength, honor, and even justice. When the legions raised the eagle standard, they believed Mars rode beside them, guiding them to victory. This difference reflected two worlds. The Greeks loved knowledge, art, philosophy, and so they despised Ares' blind frenzy, choosing instead to praise Athena, goddess of wisdom. The Romans, however, built their identity on conquest and discipline, and so Mars was revered as their protector, the same god, yet in two civilizations he lived, two fates. Even so, within Rome, the shadow of Ares lingered. Mars was honoured, but the memory of Ares whispered that war brought not only glory, but blood and destruction. Soldiers returning from campaigns carried in their eyes the gaze of Phobos, the nightmares of Deimos, as if Ares' sun still clung to them. When Christianity spread, the image of Ares divided by Mars shifted once again. The Church Fathers saw in him a symbol of violence, of pagan ways, of the demonic force mankind must resist. Yet they could not deny that throughout history, war had always walked beside humanity. Slowly, Ares' figure blurred into that of Satan, the tempter, the whisperer, the one who drove men to slaughter and bloodshed. In the Middle Ages, knights still whispered his name in the dark, not as a prayer, but as an explanation for the violence surging through their hearts. In the Renaissance, as artists and scholars revived the heritage of Greece and Rome, Ares appeared once more in painting and sculpture. But now he was not a triumphant god, but a figure subdued by love in Aphrodite's embrace, or struck down by a mortal's arrow. Artists rendered him as a reminder. No matter how great war may seem, it always carries shame and loss. By modern times, Ares was no longer worshipped, but his name lived on in language and symbol. The two moons of Mars, the red planet, were named Phobos and Deimos, as though Ares' children still orbited their father in the heavens. When humanity looks up at that crimson point in the night sky, they call it Mars, but silently recall that it is also Ares, the undying flame of war. Modern poets and writers, when they describe war, are still writing about him even without naming him. Every line describing fear in the trenches, every tale of a soldier broken by bombs, is an answer to Phobos and Deimos. Every word about meaningless destruction, about fury without reason, is a hymn to Ares. And so, posterity sees Ares with double vision. He is the one, despised by Greece, but revered by Rome. He is a demon in the eyes of Christianity, yet an immortal figure in art. He is the red planet in the sky, the stain in epic poetry, the muse of modern verse. No matter how many masks he wears, Ares remains himself, the embodiment of war, of blood, of the dark instinct humanity can never escape. War never disappears. It only changes its name, its form, the way mankind dresses it in garments of meaning. From the moment Ares drove his first spear into the earth, humanity stepped into a spiral with no escape. One war after another, blood spread red across the fields, mixing into stone and soil, as though the world itself were an endless temple to the god of war. And in every bomb blast, every war drum, every marching step, Ares' shadow lingers immortal. In the ancient world he was seen on a chariot of 4 fiery horses, roaring among ranks of spearmen. In the Middle Ages, he hid beneath the steel armour of knights, his eyes glowing through the visor, where red fire reflected Phobos and Deimos. When gunpowder thundered, Ares wore the black cloak of smoke, the roar of cannons. In the 20th century's world wars, Ares was in every trench, in the panic-stricken gaze of soldiers drowning in mud and gas. Humanity could change weapons from bronze swords to tanks, from iron spears to atomic bombs, but Ares was still the guide, whispering in their hearts, kill, destroy, survive by another's blood. What makes Ares immortal is not divine eternity, but the primal instinct in the human heart. Wherever there is greed, hatred, or the lust for power, there Ares dwells. No god lives closer to mankind, for they carry him in their very flesh and blood. The Greeks may have despised Ares, but they knew no one could erase him, just as no one can erase the darkness within the soul. Athena may teach men to fight with wisdom, but when fear overwhelms reason, Ares rises. Apollo may soothe them with music. Demeter may grant them harvests. But when the fields are trampled, when the lyre is drowned by the clash of swords, Ares emerges, head held high. He does not need to be called, for every scream on the battlefield is a summons. He needs no sacrifice. For every drop of human blood spilled is already his offering. Some say Ares is humanity's shadow, the symbol of destruction. Yet others recognize a bitter truth. Without Ares, history would not move forward. The Roman Empire, the conquests of Alexander, Even the existence of nations were written in blood, and if blood is ink, then Ares is the one holding the pen. He is not the god mankind desires, but the god they always need to justify their thirst for slaughter. In art and literature, Ares remains an undying symbol. On Renaissance canvases, he is often painted in Aphrodite's arms, a reminder that war and love always walk together, never apart. In the night sky, Mars, the red planet, still burns as Rome's image of Ares, a scarlet beacon that has watched over humanity's expansion. Even in the modern world, when people speak of the war on poverty, the war on disease, the war for justice, that language still echoes Ares. For mankind cannot escape the habit of seeing life as a battlefield, seeing rivals as enemies to be destroyed. And in every such war, Ares smiles, for he knows that even without blood, the instinct of war remains alive. Perhaps that is the true immortality of Ares. Not because he is a god, not because Olympus preserves him, but because every human carries a fragment of Ares. When they rage, when they hate, when they strike with fists, the god of war rises without being summoned. He is immortal, because mankind is immortal in its violence. He exists because humans always need an excuse to kill, to conquer, to survive. And so, the epic closes. But the song of Ares never truly ends. It will resound in war drums, in marching boots, in every line of history written in blood. Ares will always laugh in the smoke and fire, always ride his divine chariot through the screams. He is the undying shadow, the primal instinct, the god no one loves but no one can forget. For as long as there are humans, there will be war. And as long as there is war, Ares will be immortal.